It was a quiet evening in a small town far from the busy cities, where stars were clearly visible in the sky, and the wind carried the smell of fresh grass and growing tomatoes, and David was in his garden as usual, pulling out weeds and checking his vegetables. He liked the silence, the soft buzzing of insects, the sound of wind brushing against the leaves, and the gentle rustling of his jacket as he moved slowly across the soil which he had taken care of for the last 10 years after retiring from a life that no one in town really knew about. Most people thought David was just an old man who liked peace and plants, and maybe that was true now, but once he had built machines that touched stars and helped design ships that crossed solar systems, and though he never talked about it, those memories sometimes came back in dreams as he bent down to check a strange glowing mushroom that he did not remember planting. He heard a sound like a crack in the air, not like thunder, not like a plane, but something else, something sharper, something wrong. He stood up slowly and turned his head toward the forest edge near the back of his land, and that is when he saw Hershey was stumbling out of the trees holding something wrapped in a blanket. And she looked hurt, her legs weak, her body shaking, and her arms tight around the bundle she carried. David dropped the small tool in his hand and ran to her just as she collapsed near his rosebush, her knees giving up first, then her body falling to the ground, and she looked up at him, eyes wide, lips trembling, and said something with the last bit of her strength. "Please don't let them take her." Then she fainted. David looked at the bundle in her arms and carefully opened a part of the blanket, and inside was a baby no more than 6 months old, with soft skin glowing faintly like a nightlight, and her hand had a strange mark that shimmered like silver under the fading sun. The baby opened her eyes, and they were not like any eyes David had ever seen, not brown, not blue, not green, but like the sky at night, full of stars, full of silence, full of something deep and old. He picked up the woman gently and carried her inside to the basement where he once kept tools, but now it was empty and quiet and safe and cool. He placed her on the old cot and then returned for the child, holding her carefully close to his chest as he moved. Then the sirens came, not from police, not from fire trucks, but a deep low hum that seemed to come from the sky, and David knew that sound. He had helped create it once long ago. It was a scanning drone used by special forces in deep space missions, and it should not be here. Not on Earth, not above his garden. He quickly ran back outside, crouching low, and looked up through the trees, and there it was, a black drone, silent and smooth, floating like a ghost, scanning his land with a red light, moving slowly, like it was searching for something, like it already knew something had arrived. David cursed under his breath and rushed back inside, turning off all signals in the house, grabbing a small metal box from a drawer and flipping a switch. The lights blinked. Once then, everything went dark. No heat, no power, nothing digital that could be tracked. The baby looked up at him and giggled, and for a second everything felt calm, like maybe this was just a dream, like maybe he had lost his mind. But then he looked at the woman on the cot, her skin pale and cold and still breathing but weak, and then he looked at the baby's glowing hand again, and he knew this was real, and something had come to his garden that was never meant to be found. He opened the trapdoor in the floor, a hidden passage that led to the old tunnels used during the early years of his secret work, back when Earth was preparing for war that never came, but maybe it did, just not in public. He went down into the tunnel, carrying the baby and closing the trapdoor behind him as the red light of the drone slowly passed over his house and faded into the distance. The tunnel was dark and dusty, but safe, and he turned on a small hand lamp that gave off no signal and sat down with the baby, trying to think, trying to remember who could have sent that drone, who could be after a child like this, and what had this woman run from. He looked at the child and said softly, "Who are you?" And then something strange happened. The baby raised her hand, pointed at him, and smiled, and then in a voice soft and clear, she said, "One word, run asterisk." The tunnels under David's house had not seen light in many years, and the air inside was dry and full of dust that clung to his skin as he walked slowly with the child in his arms, and his heart beat heavy in his chest like a clock ticking too fast. He reached the old chamber near the end of the tunnel, a room he had built long ago with steel walls and hidden systems, the kind not even the military knew about, because David had made sure to erase every trace of this place before he retired. He placed the baby on a thick blanket on the floor, and turned on the only lamp that did not send out any signal, only light and warmth. Just enough to see her little face again, her eyes still glowing like distant stars, calm and alert, like she understood. More than a child, should the woman upstairs, still unconscious, was safe for now, but David knew time was not on his side, and he had seen too much in his life to think this would end quickly or quietly. He moved to the wall and opened a secret panel, where a small console blinked to life with weak green light, and behind that light was memory. This was old tech, old code, and David had written most of it himself long ago, when Earth first made contact with the outer colonies and feared that something would come back through the gate that could not be stopped. He typed quickly, fingers steady as if they remembered every command, every line, every password, and soon a map appeared showing not just Earth, but other systems, connections, patterns, and activity, and in the corner of that screen was a signal from the drone that passed over his home. David tracked it back to its source and found something strange. Not military, not alien, but something in between, something called Program Helix, and he had never heard of it before, and that was what scared him most. Anything this hidden, this deep, this clean was not normal and not human either. He looked back at the baby, now holding her own foot and smiling, and felt a weight in his chest he had not felt in years, a mix of fear and duty, the kind that made men do impossible things. He reached into a locked box nearby and took out a small crystal chip glowing with a soft blue light, and he held it to the side of the console and whispered a code so old even he had almost forgotten. The console blinked once, then opened a file labeled Ghost Seeds. Inside were records from a mission 20 years ago. One that was wiped from all networks, one that involved a secret project to create life that could survive beyond time itself, part human, part unknown, something planted in space and left to grow, and now maybe that child was one of them. He leaned back, eyes wide, heart heavy, and whispered softly to himself, what have they done behind him? The baby made a soft sound, and when he turned, she was standing holding the wall, steady on her small feet, and looking at him not like a child, but like someone watching, someone measuring, someone who already knew what he had just learned. He moved closer and knelt down and asked quietly, who are they? What do they want with youth? Baby reached out and touched his hand, and in that moment something rushed into his mind, a flash. A memory not his, but hers, a vision of fire and metal and dark ships floating in space with symbols no one had seen before, and people running and screaming, and a mother holding her child close, while shadows chased them through broken worlds. Then the vision ended, and David gasped for air, heart pounding, sweat on his face like he had just returned from a long dream, one he could not explain. He looked at her again, and now he understood. This child was not just special, she was important and dangerous and powerful, and they would not stop looking, not until she was taken or dead. He stood up, breathing slow, trying to think, and made his way back up the tunnel toward the house, carrying the baby again. And when he reached the top, he opened the trapdoor, carefully listening for any sound, any sign of machines. Outside all was quiet for now, only wind in the trees and leaves brushing against the walls, and the sky still dark as night. He moved to the woman and checked her pulse, still there, still weak, and he noticed a strange metal tag around her neck, one he had not seen before, shaped like a triangle with numbers, and a name that read Elira. David whispered the name, and for a second her eyes moved behind her eyelids as if she had heard it in her dreams, and her fingers curled slightly toward her chest. He sat down next to her baby, still in his arms, and looked around his quiet house, now a battlefield waiting to begin, and asked again, to the room, to the child, to the night, who are they? And in the silence came a soft voice, not his, not the baby's, but the woman's, lips barely moving as she whispered one sentence with fear in her voice and warning in her breath. They are already here. David did not sleep that night as silence filled the house like a trap waiting to close, and the weight of two lives pressed heavy on his shoulders, one too young to speak and one too weak to run. And outside, the wind carried something strange, like the air itself was listening. He sat by the window, holding the baby, who now rested with her small head against his shoulder, glowing gently with a light that did not hurt the eyes, but somehow reached into the heart and told him this child was not from a world that belonged to pain. Elira slept in the next room, her breath slow and uneven, her body recovering, but her mind clearly not at peace, and every now and then she would whisper things that made no sense. Names of stars, warnings of doors that should never open, and always. The same phrase repeated over and over, do not let them take her, David. Rose when he heard a sound soft and far at first, like a song underwater, then growing louder into a low hum like a storm without clouds, and he knew that sound too. It was the same frequency used by the recon units deep in the outer belts, the ones not built for war, but for one thing, only search and capture. He moved fast, years of training waking up inside him like an old beast shaking off sleep, and he gathered the baby, wrapped her tight in his old mission coat, and moved toward the basement entrance. But before he could open the trapdoor, Illyra cried out his name, not David, but the one only the agency had used, Red 17. He turned and saw her standing weak, but awake, eyes wide and focused, and she said, they are not coming from the sky, they are already on the ground, and one of them is inside. Your fence. David grabbed a small scanner from the shelf and flipped the switch. No lights, no sound, only a faint green pulse showing movement, and there it was, a heat signature too smooth to be human, standing still at the edge of the property near the shed, near the backup systems. He cursed it inside his mind and turned to Illyra and said, we need to go now, and she nodded and leaned on him as he helped her into the tunnel, the baby between them, silent, as if she knew speaking now would bring death. They moved through the old passage, slow but steady, and every sound around them felt louder than it should, like the walls were warning them, like the earth itself wanted them gone halfway through. Illyra collapsed again, her strength fading too fast, and David had no choice but to lift her over his shoulder, old pain shooting through his back, but his steps did not stop. Because he remembered what he saw in the vision the child had given him, and he would not let that world become real. The tunnel ended at the old escape chamber buried under the hill outside the property, and David placed Illyra down, carefully opened the metal door, and stepped into the cold night where no moon shone and only stars watched from above. He reached into the control box nearby, entered a code, and activated the emergency beacon, not to call for help but to trigger the false signal. A trick he had designed years ago to confuse any tracking system by showing multiple exits at once scattered across 10 miles. Then he guided them toward the woods using the path he had cleared long ago for moments just like this, ones he never hoped to face but always prepared for, and behind them the ground shook gently as the trapdoor collapsed, sealing the tunnel forever. Hours passed as they moved under trees, past rocks and streams and old ruins from before the cities, and the baby slept in his arms as if the world had paused for her, and Illyra said nothing more, only looked at the stars like she was counting them, checking if any were missing. They reached a small outpost hidden under a hill, made to look like an old cabin from the outside, but inside filled with gear-tech weapons and food enough to last 2 weeks, and David scanned the area for signals, found none, and locked the door behind them. Inside, Illyra finally spoke, and her words were soft but heavy. She said, they know about you, they will use your past to find us, and they have people who used to be like you, people who think Earth must be reset. David sat down, breathing hard, and placed the baby in the crib he had built years ago for a child he never had, and then he turned to Illyra and said, what is she? What makes her so important? Illyra looked at him, eyes tired and voice shaking, and she said, she is not just a child, she is the last carrier of something pure, something older than war and stronger than time, and if they get her, they will not just control Earth, they will control evolution itself. David leaned back, closed his eyes, and felt something inside him shift, not fear, not anger, but a decision, and he whispered to himself, I will not let them take her. The cabin hummed with quiet machines buried deep under layers of stone and signal-blocking walls, and inside the silence was heavy as David stared at the small crib where the child now slept, surrounded by soft light, and Illyra sat nearby, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her eyes open but looking far away into places not seen with normal sight. She had not spoken much since they escaped, only small things like names of stars and fragments of old warnings, and now as David brought her a warm cup of synth tea, she finally turned her head and said, you were not supposed to be part of this, but maybe you are the only one left who can protect her. David nodded slowly and sat down across from her and asked her again, not with force but with quiet respect, tell me who she is, not just her name, but what she is and why they want her. Illyra took a long breath and placed her hand over her heart and began to speak, not like someone sharing information, but like someone opening a locked door that had not been touched in years, and what came out was more than just words. It was history hidden behind silence. She said a long time ago, before Earth reached the outer colonies, before the stars were mapped and the moons were claimed, a signal was found deep in the Kuiper Belt, something old, something not made by us, and buried inside that signal was a code, not a message, not a warning, but a design. The council back then did not know what to do with it, so they hid it deep under Luna. In a vault with no access, no interface, no records, only fear, and after many years, someone broke the vault and activated the design, and what came next was called Project Origin. David listened without blinking as Alira spoke of experiments done in secret labs built in hollow asteroids where DNA was mixed with elements not from the system and life was formed in ways nature never allowed, and from that project a few children were born, each with a purpose and each carrying something they called the spark. Alira paused and looked at the crib, and her eyes softened, and she whispered, "She is the last one. The others were taken or lost or destroyed because they could not be controlled, but she survived, hidden, moved from world to world, protected by those who still believed in choice." David leaned forward and asked, "What does the spark do?" And Alira answered, "It connects life to life, not just humans, not just animals, but everything, and in her the spark has reached purity. If they take her, they will use her to build a system that decides who lives, who dies, who gets to evolve, and who stays behind." He sat back in silence as the weight of her words sank into him like stone into deep water, and he remembered something from long ago. A conversation during his time on Titan Base where an old scientist spoke of a theory that one day life itself would be coded and sold and used like a weapon, and now it was no longer theory. The baby stirred in her sleep, her small hand glowing softly, and a faint pulse came from her chest, not a heartbeat, but something more like a signal reaching out into the room, touching every metal surface and screen and wire, and David saw the machines near her pause and reboot without command, as if she had whispered to them without sound. Alira stood slowly and walked to the crib and placed her hand gently on the child's head and said, "She will grow fast. Her mind already sees what we cannot. Her body will not stay small for long, and when she speaks again, you must listen, because her words will not be just sound but truth wrapped in light." David stood as well and looked at the child and felt something stir in him, not fear, not duty, but something like hope mixed with fire, and he said, "If she is that important, then we cannot stay here long, because they will find us again, and next time they will bring more than drones." Alira nodded and reached into her jacket and pulled out a small disc no bigger than a coin and handed it to him, and said, "This has the last coordinates of a place called the Red Gate, a structure not built by humans, not even by those who built the spark. It is said to be a door to the core of memory itself, where life keeps its original song." David took the disc and stared at it, and for the first time in many years he felt young again, not in body but in spirit, like he was standing on the edge of something impossible and yet true. And then the baby opened her eyes, looked at him, and smiled. She lifted her hand and pointed to the far wall where no door existed, and then the light on that wall began to flicker, and a symbol appeared glowing and shifting as if alive, and David stepped forward, heart pounding, as he asked, "Alira, what is that?" And she said, "It is her way of saying we are not alone." Asterisk. The next morning did not feel like morning because the sky above the cabin was clouded and the air outside was quiet in a way that did not feel safe, and inside David moved carefully between storage crates and signal-proofed panels while the child watched him with glowing eyes, and Alira sat at the console checking data that no longer belonged to this world. David knew they had little time, and his plan was not perfect, but it was the only one they had left to follow, because the Red Gate was real and they had the coordinates now, and even though the map showed no paths leading to that place, David believed the child would guide them when the time came. As he packed supplies into the hidden transport beneath the floor, a sharp signal broke through the static of his private channel, and the voice that came through made him freeze. Not because it was unknown, but because it was a voice from his past, a voice that once stood beside him on the moons of Io and the burning sands of Mars, and that voice belonged to Thomas Gray. Thomas had been his partner during the last war, a man who saved his life more than once and vanished without a word when the system fell silent, and now his voice said only one thing: coordinates received, coming to extract hold position. David stared at the comes unit, and his hands trembled, not with fear but with something deeper, something close to doubt, because if Thomas was alive, then maybe they had more allies than he believed, or maybe they were never really friends at all. He turned to Illyra and told her someone is coming, and she looked at him and said, "Only this: if he speaks like a man, but thinks like a program, then he is not who you remember, and you must choose before he arrives." The child began to hum softly as if sensing something, and her voice echoed gently through the room like wind moving through glass, and the walls around them shimmered for a second, as if touched by some invisible wave, and David knew then that something was already watching them from above an hour past. Before the outer alarm flashed once with a soft blue light, and David walked outside past the broken fence and dead grass and saw the small lander descending from the clouds, its silver surface smooth and cold like the machines built after the collapse, and the moment it touched the ground, the hatch opened and Thomas stepped out. He looked older, his face lined with years, but his stance still sharp like the soldier he once was, and his eyes found David at once, and a smile broke across his face like sunlight in winter, and he walked forward, arms open, and said, "You always did like hiding in the dirt." David said nothing at first, only watched as Thomas moved closer, and then embraced him with the kind of warmth only shared by people who had walked through fire together, and for a moment David wanted to believe it was real. They sat inside the cabin drinking old ration tea while Thomas looked around and laughed and said, "So this is where the great Red 17 retired, among plants and peace and little miracles." And then his eyes landed on the child, and he froze for only a breath before smiling again and saying, "She is beautiful." David noticed that breath and saw the way Thomas's hand twitched near his coat as if reaching for something, and he asked, "How did you find me?" And Thomas replied, "I never lost you. We just stopped looking until we knew what you had, and now that we know, we want to help." Illyra stood up and moved between Thomas and the child, her eyes locked on his, and said, "Help is not what you bring silence wrapped in code and death hidden in words, and if you take her you will never find peace again." Thomas raised his hands slowly and said, "I am not here to fight, I am here to offer safety, the kind you cannot run from, the kind that ends all running and gives her what she deserves, a place among those who understand her value." David stood and reached under the table where his old plasma cutter rested just in case, and asked him directly, "Did you bring them with you?" And Thomas smiled again, but this time his eyes did not smile, and he said, "They are already here. And you just gave them everything." At that moment, the outer wall exploded inward, and a flash of light blinded the room as machines poured in, small, silent, and shaped like spiders, with red sensors blinking and weapons unfolding, and David grabbed the child and pulled Illyra toward the back wall, which opened with a voice command only he knew. They ran through the emergency shaft as the cabin behind them caught fire, and Thomas shouted from the flames, "You cannot run forever, and you will give her to us, because Earth has no place left for gods." David ran harder than he had in years, the child clinging to him, the heat chasing them like an angry ghost, and Illyra bleeding from her shoulder, but alive and whispering the same words over and over, "We must reach the gate. We must reach the gate. We must." Asterisk. The desert stretched out before them like an ocean of red dust and broken stone, and the sky above held no clouds, no birds, no sound, just the constant hum of solar waves brushing against the forgotten edge of the world. And in that place beyond maps and roads, David stood at the base of the last rise with the child in his arms and Illyra leaning on him, barely able to walk behind them. The path was gone, erased by storms that moved faster than thought, and ahead of them stood the hill known in ancient files as Hollow Spine, a name found only once in a corrupted data set buried inside a Mars rover's damaged core, and yet that same name had appeared on the disk Illyra gave him, and now it was the last location left, unmarked by war or machines or betrayal. The sun had begun to set bleeding gold across the horizon when they reached the top, and what they saw was not a building, not a gate in any human sense, but a hole in the fabric of space itself. A vertical ring hovering above the cracked earth, spinning slowly and wrapped in a red light that pulsed like a heartbeat and made the air around it ripple like water. David stared at it with eyes that had once watched stars being born through a telescope on Europa, and even then he had never felt so small, so out of place, and yet so strangely welcome. And The child reached out toward the gate with both hands as if she knew it had been waiting for her all along. Jalira collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, and said, "This is it. This is the place where the spark first touched matter, the place where memory lives before it becomes time," and her voice shook with awe and pain and something that sounded almost like fear. David helped her sit and placed the child gently in her lap, then stepped forward to the edge of the light and watched it shimmer and fold inward, revealing flashes of places that did not exist and voices that had no mouths and stars that pulsed with colors no eye had ever seen. The child stood up on her own and took one step forward, her feet not touching the ground, her body surrounded by a glow that danced with patterns David could not understand, and suddenly the machines within his pack began to shut down, not from damage, but as if ordered to sleep by something older than programming. Jalera whispered that the gate is not a machine and not a door. It is a mind that sees through time and remembers everything, and it only opens when it knows the one before it carries the song of first light, and the child is that song shaped into flesh. As the glow deepened, David felt the temperature drop and the wind stop, and even his own heartbeat slowed as if his body was waiting for permission to continue, and in that stillness the child turned and looked at him and spoke with a voice layered in echoes and silence. She said, "The path is not through the gate, but into the memory behind it, and you must come with me because I cannot walk alone, and your name is written into the door." David moved toward her, not because he understood, but because something in him responded without question. Like his bones knew the rhythm of her words, and his blood remembered a promise made before he was even born. Then the gate cracked open like ice under weight, and inside was not space, but something that looked like a hallway made of stars and veins and light bending in shapes that hurt to look at and yet felt like home. And without another word, the child stepped into the light and vanished like dust in morning wind. David turned back to Alira, who now held her side as blood soaked her coat and her face pale as stone, and she said, "You must follow her. I will hold the path for as long as I can, but you must go now before the gate forgets your name." He wanted to argue, but her eyes told him she had already decided, and so he stepped into the light, and the gate swallowed him whole, and silence returned to the desert. As the sun dropped behind the horizon and the wind began to blow again, inside the gate was not dark and not bright, but filled with voices that spoke in music and light that felt like warmth, and walls that moved like thoughts, and David floated, not falling, not rising, just moving through moments that felt like memories that were not his. He saw flashes of planets untouched by machines and children, born without fear, and skies that never burned, and at the center of it all was the child standing before a great tree that pulsed like a heart, and above her floated a symbol that David had once seen in a dream long ago, a symbol that meant choice. The child looked at him and said, "The final step must be made by you, not by me, and you must decide if I should stay hidden or rise and awaken the old truth that earth forgot." David stood before her and reached out his hand, and as their fingers touched, the tree behind her opened, and the world around them began to change. The world inside the red gate was no longer memory and no longer dream, but something between the two, something that breathed with every step David took as he followed the child through fields of shifting light and rivers of sound that flowed without water, and trees made of thought that bloomed with stars instead of leaves. The child moved ahead of him without fear, her small feet never touching the strange glowing ground, and her hands stretched forward toward something he could not yet see, and behind them came the soft echo of Alira's voice, fading like the end of a song carried on the wind, and David knew she was gone, but not lost, not truly. Around them the realm began to change, like a clock turning faster, like a machine remembering its purpose, and the path they walked became a bridge across a great void, and in that void were shapes, watching, waiting, breathing without lungs, and thinking without form. The child turned to him and spoke with a voice that was no longer only hers, but filled with others, older, deeper, softer, and said, "The world behind us has chosen to forget what it was, and now it wants to decide what it becomes without knowing what it could be, and they will come here to take this choice from me and from you and from all who might follow." David reached her side and took her hand, and in that moment he felt every life he had ever touched, every word he had ever spoken, and every path he had ever chosen unfold before him like pages in a book he had never read but always carried. And The child looked up at him and said, I do not want to be a weapon, I want to be a beginning from. The far side of the void a light began to rise sharp and cold, and shaped like the machines that hunted them, the machines Thomas had called allies, and they came with silence and speed and certainty, and their goal was not fear and not hate, but control, and they brought with them the echo of every world they had changed and every voice they had silenced. David turned and stood between the child and the light and reached into the place where memory and code met, where his name, Red 17, still lived and called out not in words but in will, and from the edges of the void came answers from parts of him that still remembered war and hope. And the cost of both the machines reached the bridge and stopped, not out of mercy, but confusion, because the gate had never resisted them, and now it did, and they scanned the light and the child and him, and asked one question through the pulse of the void: is she ready to be used? David stepped forward and said, she is not here to be used. She is here to choose, and that is something you cannot take, no matter how many wires you build or how many stars you burn. And the bridge shook with power as the child lifted her hands and released the spark, not as a weapon but as a wave of truth. Machines faltered, not because they feared, but because the truth was something they had erased long ago, something they had hidden even from themselves. And now it returned through light and song, and every program that had once been human cried out in silence as the spark moved through them and asked, do you remember who you were before the code? The void shattered like glass under fire, and the machines vanished, not in destruction but in awakening. And the child turned to David with tears in her glowing eyes and said, they are free now, and I am still here, and now it is your turn to choose. He looked at the tree at the center of this strange world, the tree that pulsed with life and memory and legacy, and he knew the gate would not stay open forever, and he also knew that Earth was still broken, still watched by men like Thomas who waited for a chance to try again. He knelt down and placed his hand on the ground and said, I will return with her, not as her protector, but as her voice, and wherever she walks, I will walk, and wherever she leads, I will follow, because no one will take her, not while I breathe, not while I remember this place. The tree opened once more, and the light wrapped around them like arms, and the world folded back into itself, and then they were gone from the red gate and standing in the quiet hills far from the burned cabin where it all began. The sky was clear, the wind was soft, and the stars above seemed to blink in approval, and the child held David's hand and whispered, you did not let them take me, and now I will help you give the world back to itself. And so they walked down the hill into the waiting dark, into a future that did not yet exist, carrying with them the one thing no one could program or predict, a choice made not from fear or control, but from the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, humanity could still be something more.